Hi, everyone. Welcome to another episode of Outspoken 101. It's just Kyle today. Bolo couldn't make it, unfortunately. But today, we've thought that since we are celebrating Earth Day and since this is a debate podcast, we have to recognize that some things are less debatable than others. One such fact is that the climate is changing. The Earth is warming up, water levels are rising. That's why in debate, we don't really fight each other over what the facts are. Most of the time, we debate about what to do with the facts that we have. And a very common debate under the environment theme is communication. That is, how do we communicate the threat of climate change in a way that would create the most positive action? Do we start doom threads? Should we be optimistic? Should we be pessimistic? And stuff like that. And these issues are very important. We try to be as persuasive as possible in the debate room, but what works in a debate room might not work in real life. If you want to be advocates, we need to look a little bit into the psychology of climate change. So today, I want to share with you an article from Robert Gifford named The Dragons of Inaction: Psychological Barriers That Limit Climate Change Mitigation and Adaptation, and a book by George Marshall entitled Don't Even Think About It: Why Our Brains Are Wired to Ignore Climate Change. I'll discuss both of them with my own research, but the broad thing I'll talk about is there are cognitive biases that hinder us from taking action to fight climate change. Whether these actions center around like personal responsibility or collectively demanding accountability from large polluters, which is, by the way, another debate in and of itself, we need to first know how to get people engaged enough to act. Because those debates don't mean anything if you don't get people engaged enough to act. And actually, I would love to talk about the effects of climate change on our own mental health, such as this relatively new condition called solastalgia, but I'll hold off on that for maybe like Mental Health Awareness Month. I'll talk about a lot of the things that were mentioned in this article and in this book, but I won't promise at all that I'm going to be talking about all of them. So I highly encourage everyone to read these books for themselves. If you're watching this on YouTube, you can see a screenshot or an image that we got from the article of Gifford, The Dragons of Inaction, because I cannot cover all of these things at the same time. There are at least like a couple of dozen items here, but for now, let's ask the question, why don't people seem to care? Because there are people who seem to care a whole lot, right? But studies have actually shown that this is correlated with a certain level of privilege. According to the Pew Research Center, in most places, people who are wealthier than average are more likely to act on climate change. We also see a big difference in the willingness to change lifestyle depending on how educated a person is. For example, in Belgium, 81% of people with more education have said they would be more willing to make some or a lot of changes in how they live to reduce the effects of global climate change compared to people with less education, of which only 67% said they'd be willing to make those changes. And even in terms of income, 76% of people with higher income say they'd make changes to their lives compared to only 66% of those who have less than the average level of income. So that means that although poorer people are disproportionately affected by climate change, they're less likely to be willing to make greener changes to their lives, which makes sense if you think about it. A consulting firm based in the Netherlands found that green products cost more than 75% as compared to less environmentally friendly products. And many poor people just can't afford that. A really good example is shampoo. You can either buy one sachet of shampoo every day for a month or a bottle of shampoo that will last a month. And buying a bottle of shampoo would be cheaper in the long run, as well as more environmentally friendly because there's not as much trash with 30 shampoo sachets just flying around. But if you're living on, let's say, 30 pesos a day, buying a bottle of shampoo means you can't eat for a couple of days, or you won't shower for a couple of days. Or take boots. A poor person who earns $38 a month plus allowances, for them, a really good pair of leather boots could cost $50. So it's out of their price range. They're more likely to go for an affordable pair of boots, which were only okay for a season or two, and then it will leak like hell when the cardboard would give out. But that would at least cost $10. And these are the kinds of boots that a poor person would always buy. And they would wear it until the soles were thin. But the thing was that good boots last for years and years. And a man who could afford only $50, if they have a pair of boots and they got a $50 pair, they'd still be keeping their feet dry in 10 years' time. While a poor person could only afford cheap boots that would have spent $100 of boots in the same time and they'd still end up with wet feet. And that last one about boots was almost verbatim taken from Terry Pratchett's Discworld novels. And that's why this whole phenomenon about why it's more expensive to be poor is called the Boots theory of socioeconomic inequality or socioeconomic unfairness. So surely there are economic factors that constrain people's ability to care. Why would I care about something like that, like the environment, something that will happen very far away into the future, when I literally cannot afford to eat today? But there are also psychological barriers that make it hard, not impossible, but certainly hard to act on the environment. So Robert Gifford said that while structural problems may make it beyond an individual's reasonable control, what about the rest of us? What about people like me in the middle class? What's stopping us from making these changes? And that leads us to the first dragon of inactivity, which is limited cognition. Here, I want to talk about a few things: the ancient brain problem, ignorance, environmental numbness, uncertainty, judgmental discounting, optimism bias, and self efficacy. All of these things you can use as frameworks or parts of your argument if you're a debater. That's a lot to unpack for the first dragon. So let's tackle them one by one. So, when we're talking about the ancient brain aspect of limited cognition, what Gifford says is we have an ancient brain. What he means by that is our brains haven't evolved much for millennia. Our brains evolved until we got through the agricultural phase and civilizations, but not much after that, since there weren't a lot of evolutionary pressures that forced us to change. So our ancestors were concerned with what was immediately there, immediate dangers, and we were never really equipped to think about things that are very far away. And I call this psychological distance. George Marshall also wrote that most people regard climate change as a non urgent and psychologically distant risk. And this is related to Gifford's idea of the ancient brain, because people may not feel the immediate impacts of climate change in their daily lives, or they might not see it as a pressing issue compared to other concerns like COVID or the economy. So our brains, furthermore, are not very good at math involving large numbers. When we were kids, we were taught how to count, right? Like one, two, three, and we'd compete for the highest number that you can count to. So now if you can count to 100, if you say one number per second without stopping, that'll take you less than 2 minutes, right? Because 2 minutes is 120 seconds. Just you have 20 seconds to spare. And that's easy, right? But if you count until 1000, that will take you 20 minutes. That's still fine, right? Like you can listen to half a Taylor Swift album and you still have a bit more to go. But if you count until 1 million, that number, that amount of time you need to count until that million jumps to 12 days. If you count to 1 billion, it jumps even further. It will take you 32 years. And for 1 trillion, it'll take you almost 32,000 years. That's why it's so difficult to comprehend how much money $1 billion is. In the same way, climate change involves large numbers, such as the amount of carbon dioxide emitted by human activities each year. These numbers can be difficult for people to comprehend, especially if you're being too technical or too scientific about it. Climate change also has very long time horizons. So, when we're doing something today, an environmentalist might say, be careful, because whatever it is you're doing will be felt 10, 20 decades from now, right? Our ancient brain is not equipped to handle that. Our ancient brain is designed to think, okay, but how can I survive this week? How can I survive this year? And this can make it challenging for people to feel a sense of urgency about taking action now. And when people hear that, for example, the Earth's temperature is going to rise by 2 degrees Celsius by the end of the century, they might not fully grasp what this means in terms of real world impacts. And when people hear that carbon dioxide emissions need to be reduced by 80% by 2050 to avoid catastrophic climate change, what the heck does that even mean? How can I visualize that if I can't even visualize 1,000,000 pesos? So, what does this mean for us environmental advocates? This means that we need to change our messaging to focusing on immediate concerns and in a simple language that doesn't involve huge numbers. We are finite beings. So, if the numbers that we're talking about approach the infinite, it's physically difficult to comprehend. So, if you're judging people that they don't want to understand it, it's because you're making it so difficult for them. You're better off using your mental energy to think about what to eat tomorrow rather than think about what will happen 80 years in the future or think about the infinite number of unborn generations that you're going to affect, right? Which leads you to the next manifestation, which is ignorance. And this is very familiar to us. Sometimes you just don't know stuff, right? But it can be a barrier in two ways. One is just not knowing that there even is a problem. According to a 2006 poll by the Pew Research Center, a big chunk of people answer they don't know about climate change. But another dimension to this is simply that even if you are aware of the problem, you might remain ignorant about the extent of climate change. And as a result, you might be ignorant about what the best practices are, how to go about those practices, and to what extent each of those practices can benefit the environment. For example, you might know that a solar panel is good for your home, but you might have no idea how to get solar panels in your own home, even in the Philippines. In the 2016 PIDC or Philippine Intercollegiate Debating Championships, the semifinals was about suspending patents on green technology. So, as you might have predicted, the debate was about being able to create more of the same green technology versus encouraging innovation. And the team that won argued that we should suspend the patents because the tech that we have is good enough, but there are barriers that prevent mass adoption. So our problem isn't really quality, it's access. In other words, people know there's a problem, but do not know how to get access to problem solving technology. So, what does this mean for advocates? It means that when we're talking about access, it means that there should be knowledge of the thing that you want them to adopt and the process by which they would adopt it. It's not enough to just say there's a piece of technology there, please adopt it. Expect them to just adopt it, even if they don't know how. So you want to make it easier for them to adopt it. So I guess I'm not saying that there's no way to win on the other side of the patent debate. I think that another team might say and oppose this by saying that we agree that it's about access. But right now, it's just actually very expensive to make, even if you remove the patent. But if we encourage innovation, we might create more and more efficient technology that'll make it cheaper and cheaper for everyone to be able to access it, right? And make the process even easier. And that's also something that is included in the process of competition and innovation. So, whatever side you fall on in that patent debate, I think what we should agree on is the idea that it's all about access. It's about giving people access, not just to the thing, but knowledge of the thing and knowledge of the process by which to get that thing. Okay? And another cognitive limitation that we have is environmental numbness. Jordan Peterson, who is one of my favorite debaters to hate watch because he's just so wrong most of the time. But he once criticized on the Joe Rogan podcast that environmentalists say that climate change is everything and you can't study everything because that means you have to change everything. In other words, Jordan Peterson said this, okay? I think this is wrong. He said everything means nothing. It sounds nice. Indeed, there's a small bit of truth in what he said, the premise, but I was taken to wild conclusions. Because the environment, even if it's true that it's composed of so many more elements that we can monitor, the world is a finely tuned system, right? So there are so many things that interact with so many other things. For example, if you eat lamb in the UK, but the lamb was raised in the UK, that's not the optimal way to eat lamb in terms of the environment. Because the carbon footprint of UK raised lamb eaten in the UK is higher compared to the carbon footprint of New Zealand raised lamb eaten in the UK. So, how are we supposed to know about all this? How are we supposed to make sense of all of that every single time we go out to eat? And on a more immediate level, people are often numb to most of what's in their environment, even if they're being given mild difficulties. So, there are probably 50 things in my current environment that I'm unaware of, even though I've lived in this room for the past 20 years, my entire life, actually. So that's the first form of environmental numbness. Even when you're there, you might be unaware. Oh, that rhymes. But yeah, that's the first form of environmental numbness. But also today, the heat index where I'm at is 40 degrees. That is to say, even though the actual temperature is only 35 degrees Celsius, we feel like it is 40 degrees Celsius. But as far as I'm concerned, every single day is similarly hot. Like, I can't really tell the difference between 40 degrees and 35 degrees. So this kind of thing can become normalized as well, which is the second form of environmental numbness, which is habituation. We can extend that to seeing the same advertisement many times. Our attention to it decreases as we become more accustomed to it. In the movie Tomorrowland, the villain gave up on humanity and climate change because everyone enjoyed apocalypse movies. And the argument that the villain was trying to make was that we've become so habituated to the idea of the apocalypse that we've subconsciously accepted it as an inevitability rather than something that we can solve. And what this means for us is we ought to vary our messaging. Don't be too optimistic all the time. Don't be too pessimistic all the time. So, if we do that, what we predict is there are many different opportunities to pay attention and to learn. And if we do that, we might be able to change more minds. The next cognitive barrier that I want to talk about is uncertainty. Basically, we're not sure about what will happen. When we have uncertainty, either as to the future or to the planet, we tend to make selfish decisions, such as overfish. Even in debate or school, you can see this. When you're uncertain about the use of calculus in your life after school, you tend to say, never mind, I won't study this. So uncertainty is an excuse or a justification for inaction. Gifford and Marshall both talked about this. Marshall wrote that no scientist will ever be able to say with total certainty that any single weather event is caused by climate change. Conversations are fueled by hunch and rumor. But you might be asking yourself, wait, I thought the facts aren't debatable. Where's the uncertainty? Why do scientists not say something with complete certainty? This is where we have to talk about the philosophy of science for a bit. Because when we're talking about science, they don't necessarily say that we're 100% sure. And that is because the way that they arrive at their conclusions is through a process of induction rather than deduction. Deduction is the process of reasoning whereby you get general rules and get implications from those rules. And you're 100% certain that those rules apply or are true, right? So, for example, a triangle has three sides. And if you remove one side, it's no longer a triangle, right? So, a deductive argument would say something like, if something has three sides, it is a triangle. This thing does not have three sides. Therefore, this thing is not a triangle. That's deduction. You're 100% certain that thing is not a triangle. But in science, it's through the use of induction. You're not sure if it will apply in all cases because you just repeated the experiment over and over and over again until you have maybe 99.9% certainty, but it's not complete certainty. And that's a very generous estimate, like 99.9%. A lot of the time, human error factors into it, so you won't get the same results every single time. There might be also other factors that might contribute to that thing happening and not necessarily the thing that you're studying, right? So when we're talking about the philosophy of science, just generally, it's very difficult to ever get a 100% certain answer from science. We thought, based on our science at the time, 100% that the Earth was the center of the universe. And then that was wrong. So you can explain a lot of the things that we see using a theory. So what we're doing in science is we're just waiting for an exception to that rule that will shatter the entire paradigm. And that's the reason why most science does not say anything with absolute certainty. And for political reasons, a lot of pundits and politicians use this uncertainty as an excuse to avoid taking action on climate change or to justify their skepticism towards environmental issues. They say stuff like the science is not all in yet. Scientists do not all agree. And this is very bad. This is not the best way to think about this because even if we're not sure, it's still worth it to take some precautions. And that's the reason why in environmental law, we have something called the precautionary principle, where we say that if there are harms that you can predict that will happen to the environment, even if the science is not absolutely certain, because it rarely is, you still have a responsibility to take precautionary measures to prevent that harm happening. So that barrier, uncertainty, prevents us from talking about it. What use is there to talk about it if we're not even sure what we're talking about? So, what this means for us is let's focus on the things that we do know. So, you might not be able to agree that climate change is a thing, but you can agree that sea levels are rising. I don't think anybody has said that sea levels are not rising. This is just something that everyone agrees on. The cause of it, some people just say it's like man made climate change, other people say this, that's just natural. But what are we going to do about it? So instead of talking about those greater issues about like climate change as a whole, maybe you can talk about like very specific things that are not even being debated. And the next barrier I want to talk about is judgmental discounting. Discounting in this sense refers to your undervaluing of distant or future risks. And this also applies to undervaluing risks in your area compared to risks in other areas. You're discounting in your own judgments. According to Gifford, many people believe that the environmental situation is worse in other places compared to wherever they are, even if the environmental situation is actually really bad where they are. And this discounting, even if objectively true, makes people hesitate to act. They compare themselves and they say, those other places aren't doing anything. I don't want to look like a whiny brat. And in his book, Marshall recounts a communication between him and someone he knew after Hurricane Sandy. She said, climate change, duh, of course it's happening, but it's bigger than anything we could make a difference on. We just want to go home, and you will deal with all that lofty stuff loft some other day. This shows not only the concept of environmental numbness in relation to cognitive limitations, but also discounting. So, in our case, what can you do? The first thing is to be aware of it. You need to catch yourself in the act of rationalizing and trying to absolve yourself of the responsibility to act. Because just because it's worse in other places doesn't mean your own place has to remain bad. It's also important to localize messaging. Forget about other places. Do what you can for your immediate community's environmental situation. The next thing I want to talk about is optimism bias. Generally, optimism is good. I personally believe that we should always remain hopeful. Hank Green was very influential to me in this regard because Hank argues that even if we miss some deadlines in the fight against climate change, that's no reason to give up. Some people say, oh, we missed the deadline. What even is the point? There is still a point because the end result is not an apocalypse automatically. We can still mitigate things. We can still make things less bad than they could have been if we had given up. But optimism can be overdone. We can discount personal risks like our likelihood for heart attack. And that's something that applies to many of us, even outside of the climate change discussion. But it can also apply to environmental risks like radon exposure or environmental hazards. I know, for example, that the UV rays that hit my face when I walk around will increase my risk of skin cancer, but I keep forgetting to get sunscreen and apply it. And by extension, there's also some optimism that says we got this, things will all work out. But things will only work out when we act. So leaning on optimism too much might prevent conditions from arising that are required for the best outcome to happen. We sometimes talk about in debate this concept of a self-fulfilling prophecy, where you think, oh, it's not going to work. So you don't try to make it work. And as a result, it doesn't work. This is an opposite version of that, where you think that it will all work out. So you don't do anything to make it work out. And so it doesn't work out. So overconfidence can also be very bad for the environment. Over optimism is not that good, but you should still remain optimistic because that can push you to actually do stuff. Don't think about things like, oh, the apocalypse is inevitable. Think about it's like we are in the opening crawl to an apocalypse movie. I got this from some more news. Check it out. But yeah, we're still in the prologue and we can still avert that apocalypse, maybe in like a slightly bad version of paradise, but we can still change a lot. But the last manifestation of limited cognition that Gifford talks about is perceived behavioral control and self efficacy. This is the collective action problem. Climate change is a global problem, so many people believe that there's nothing that they can do about it. There's a strong predictor of whether they choose to take public transportation or a car. This self control, self efficacy, that's a very strong predictor of whether they choose to take public transportation. If I take the bus or train today instead of my own car or take a grab, I'll still be in traffic. There will still be traffic. So I might as well choose comfort. Many people know in their hearts that it would be better if you all relied on public transportation more. But for some reason or another, they don't believe that their actions change anything. And this is what we mean by low self efficacy. And when that happens, they start to desire a car more and more for practical reasons. And since more people have cars, there will be less demand for public transportation. And the government surely will say, just buy a car. We don't need to give you more public transportation. And that less demand for public transportation leads to even more traffic. And when you have more traffic, the more that people think that their choice to take the bus won't do anything. So it's a negative feedback loop. The more that people don't act, the worse traffic gets. The worse that traffic gets, the less likely it is that people will start acting. And when we're talking about climate change, it's the same thing. You don't want to do something because what even is the point? Even if I pick up all the trash that I see, it's not going to stop a big polluter from polluting. But that's the thing, right? If you don't do that, things will pile up, right? Or if you say, I wish I could speak up against a major polluter, a single voice can't do anything. 100 voices can't do anything. So you don't do it. And so these major polluters get more money and they use that money to buy more influence with politicians, which makes the politicians more likely to protect their special interests. So that's the problem that we have. Low self-efficacy. It's the same with voting, honestly, and a lot of honestly many other like problems that we see in society today. But that's it for limited cognition. The first dragon. I'll speed through the next few dragons because I'm chasing a deadline here. Actually, I want to talk about the first three dragons only. But also, I feel like cognitive limitations are the most important things for us to learn as advocates because we can craft messages that address these issues on our own time and at any time, really, even when you're just a debater. But the second thing I want to talk about, the second dragon, is ideology. So here I want to talk about worldviews, superhuman, actually, it's superhuman powers, and religion, and techno salvation, and a bias towards status quo. So, first, when we talk about worldview, really what we're talking about is the fact that having a particular worldview can predict whether you are believing or disbelieving in global warming. A particular worldview can lead to people exhibiting the confirmation bias a lot. And the confirmation bias is when we cherry pick information. In extreme cases, you might automatically reject information that scientists believe specifically because scientists said it. Even on our best days, we cherry pick information. So, for example, let's say it's a hot day. It's a hot day. If you ask someone like me on a hot day about global warming, you're more likely to say that's a very bad problem. But you're less likely to say something like this on a cold day. On a cold day, you'll say, yeah, it's a problem, and then that's it. Whereas on a hot day, you'll be like, man, climate change is a huge problem. We need to fix this. But on a cold day, you're like, yeah, there is global warming and it is a problem. But let's talk about it next time. So this is another issue. That's mental availability. When environmental stimuli that indicate global warming are more accessible to you, you're more likely to believe in global warming. But if they're not as accessible, if you still need to think about it, it makes you less sure of that thing, of the way that you view reality. So mental availability is actually there even in how you view yourself, how you view certain types of motions, how you view debating, how you view any kind of activity. It's mental availability. And finally, and I feel like this is the worst, people might even double down. And that is to say, you would expect, right, if someone gets hit by a climate disaster and originally they were skeptical, you would think that after that climate disaster, they would say that climate change is real. I've changed my mind. This is a harrowing experience, and I realized something. But the opposite might happen. People might believe in whatever it is they're believing even more. So you'd think that being hit by Hurricane Sandy, for example, would change their mind. So George Marshall in his book talks about a victim of Hurricane Sandy who was a farmer and was also a Republican. If they didn't believe in global warming before, you'd think that Hurricane Sandy would have changed their mind. But it made them disbelieve global warming even more. Because if they accept global warming after spending so much money to rebuild their farm, that would be the same thing as accepting that more Hurricane Sandys will come and spending more money. And the idea that they were wrong the entire time. And that dissonance is so unpleasant that they're more likely to just believe that Hurricane Sandy is a one off, an exception rather than the future rule. The second thing I want to talk about is, very briefly actually, superhuman powers or religion. And this can frustrate climate action. People might believe that some deity or Mother Nature will not forsake them, or the idea that why should we even care about what happens here when even if we suffer a lot and we praise God even while we're suffering, we're more likely to be in heaven for eternity. So these kinds of beliefs, I'm not saying that we should diss people for their religious beliefs, but what I am saying is that we need to engage with them on that level. If you're a Catholic and someone says, I don't really believe that we should take that much action with respect to climate change because this isn't really God's kingdom. We should just wait to be in God's kingdom. We need to engage with them on that level. So you have to recognize a lot of people have religious views on climate change and global warming and engage with them on that level. But next, and this is, I feel like, very important for a lot of tech issues, which is techno salvation. Techno salvation refers to the idea that you will either stop climate change with technology or adapt to it with technology. This is where we see debates about adapting to climate change rather than mitigating its effects. That's also why you see Elon Musk and Jeff Bezos try to go to Mars. The result of that is they don't really want to fix the environment anymore. Adaptation means let's act towards moving a seemingly unsolvable problem. That's what they want to happen. That's techno salvation. The idea that, well, we don't really need to change anything because maybe in the future, let's just keep pumping carbon dioxide into the atmosphere because in the future, I'm pretty sure that they're going to invent something that will take all the carbon dioxide away, right? This idea, this feels like a little bit like optimism, but it's specifically about technology. This idea of techno salvation, and this is especially prevalent in places where the impact of capitalism is quite strong, right? The idea that we can do anything that we set our minds to, but in the meantime, right, before we get that technology, how many people will get hurt? Is that sacrifice even worth it? Another thing that I want to talk about is a bias towards status quo. This is also known as system justification. When citizens are fortunate enough to have a comfortable lifestyle, the tendency to not rock the boat or maybe not make people change the way that things currently are. And you can see this outside of climate change as well. Take the pandemic. Everyone wanted to go back to normal. Everyone still wants to go back to normal, right? That's the same thing that happens in climate change, especially during a natural disaster. Marshall wrote that the pain and loss of the event, in this case, I think it was Hurricane Sandy or maybe Haiyan. But anyway, he wrote that the pain and loss of that event generates an intensified desire that there be a normal state to which one can return, making it even harder for people to accept that there are larger changes underway. The decision to stay, rebuild, and reinvest in that normality is validated by the community. So the point here is we know that we need to change, but there's still a bias towards retreating to the comfort zone. Even if you get hit, you still want to get back into that comfort zone. And when what you should be doing is rebuild with the notion of sustainability in mind. But that's not really what's on their minds right now. What they want is for things to return to normal. And that's one of the ways that ideology, specifically the ideology that prefers status quo, prevents climate change or meaningful climate change action. The last dragon I want to talk about is comparisons with other people. I just want to talk about two things here. The first is, very briefly, social comparison. People compare their actions with others. So, when you're thinking about a proper course of action, we often understand it as one that the rest of the community also does. There's a network effect that happens here. For example, you're more likely to start biking if other people you know bike. You're more likely to become a vegetarian or vegan if people who are vegetarian or vegan. And on the vegetarianism point, you're more likely to change that diet if there are options. And instead of just Jollibee, what if they had uh, plant-based chicken joy, right? You're more likely to change the diet if there are options because the presence of that option tells you that many people are actually comfortable with that. And it tells you that, oh, even when I compare myself to others, they're also doing it. I should also do it. So there's an idea of FOMO, right? The Another way to look at it is it's called social contagion, where some behaviors, some actions, some beliefs are socially and culturally contagious. So maybe when we're talking about messaging, let's try to make it more contagious. Yeah, I don't know what else to say about that. But another thing is social norms. Norms can be good or bad. There was a 2007 study, and it found that when homeowners were told the amount of energy that the average member of the community used, everyone else tended to alter their use of energy to fit that norm, whether it is by increasing their energy use or decreasing it. Their point is, I don't want to be an outlier. I don't want to be an outlier. Let's go back to the norm. Let's go back to the media. And that can be good or bad. It can be good if the norm, the average, is actually quite low. The outlier would feel bad. Okay, let me go back lower. But if the average is very high, that will give people a license to also do that thing. Which is why on hot days like this, you know that the best thing for you to do, the most environmentally friendly thing for you to do, is probably use a physical fan or maybe an electric fan. But most people use air conditioning. And that's the reason why you are probably using air conditioning today. So, those are the dragons I wanted to talk about. Honestly, I could have gone on for way longer, but my voice is already hurting. The way that I want to conclude this episode and by extension this lecture is it's clear that psychological barriers play a significant role in hindering climate change action. While that is true, it's crucial to remember that we as individuals, as debaters, as advocates, we have the power to overcome these obstacles. And by understanding the underlying mechanisms of these barriers, we can work together to develop effective strategies and encourage sustainable behavior and foster a collective sense of responsibility towards our planet. And while we continue to raise awareness, while we continue to debate about environmental issues, climate change, its consequences, we should also strive to empower one another through education, dialogue, inspiration. Reach out to your local community. Think about what are the ways that you can help the environment literally near you. Don't compare your situation, your community with another community. because you're falling into a psychological trap, right? And when we share our successes as well, and we support our peers, and we celebrate positive actions, we can gradually change social norms and make sustainable choices that are more appealing and more accessible to everyone. So I know that this is a challenge, right? But as I mentioned in a previous episode or perhaps a previous lecture, have a growth mindset. Embrace the challenges instead of seeking the comfort zone because the future is not yet written. And we all have a role to play in shaping a more sustainable world. And I think that we can still turn the tide. I'm still extremely optimistic about this. And it's our collective responsibility to take action and get to work. So let's not be discouraged by the obstacles that we talked about in this lecture, but instead, let's use them as an opportunity to innovate and change the way that we view our messaging, the way that we try to persuade others, the way that we interact with others as well, and rise above. Yeah, that's it for this episode and this lecture. I'll see you in the next one. Bye.